everybody. This video is going to go over the PowerPoint on Chapter 18, writing about persona and tone. So we're going to talk first about the persona. And just like, when you have you're reading a short story or a novel, you have a narrator. And the narrator is not the author. It is a character, a persona that the author has created. Sometimes they even argue that even when it's in first person and it's autobiographical, that it's still a persona that's created. But we typically will think of fiction here, and we understand the concept of a narrator. Well, in poetry, the exact same thing occurs. Even though because poetry seems more emotional and more personal, we often assume that the words of the poem are coming straight from the poet, that it is literally their words, literally their ideas and how they feel and what they believe and what they have experienced. But that is not necessarily the case. There is such a thing as confessional poetry, where you can make the argument that these are things that the poet really was thinking and feeling. But for the most part, we stay away from that. And we think of the poem just as we would a piece of fiction, and that the person who is telling it to us is a character that the author created, a persona. In poetry, we call that persona the speaker. Probably because poetry has its roots as an oral tradition, not written. That's where it started. So that's probably why we still refer to it as a speaker. Because really all poetry is often intended to be spoken aloud. So we call that persona the speaker. And throughout the poem, we often learn many different things about that persona. One thing that we pick up on with the persona is the tone, right? Just as if you're having a conversation with someone, how you speak, your tone of voice can say a lot. Not just the words you say, but how you say them, right? So we need to pay attention to the persona, the speaker, and their tone throughout the poem. All right? There's a slew, just a plethora of words you could use to describe the tone of a piece. Just like there's 100 ways we could refer to someone's tone of voice. We're going to look at some of those terms here in a moment, but I want to draw your attention first to a very specific type of tone, and that would be verbal irony. Now, verbal irony is when the tone that we use suggests that we mean the opposite of what we're actually saying. So for instance, if you are having a really rough day, something bad has happened, and you are barely holding it together and you are on the verge of tears, and your friend comes in and says, "Oh my, you certainly look cheerful today," they clearly mean the opposite of what the words actually meant. But you have to pick up on that tone, the irony, to understand it. Otherwise, them coming in and saying, "You certainly look cheerful today," makes us think they're an idiot. Like, no, clearly not. Are you blind? So there's a lot of room for misinterpretation and misunderstanding if you don't pick up on the verbal irony. It can border on sarcastic at times, but verbal irony in and of itself does not necessarily have to be sarcastic. It's just anytime the tone implies that the meaning is the exact opposite of the actual words, then, you have to really pay attention and make sure that you're not missing it, because sometimes to miss the irony is to miss the entire meaning of a poem. And sometimes the irony is just, the verbal irony is just one moment in the poem. Sometimes it is something that's carried throughout from start to finish. there's a really good example of this in the textbook. In Chapter 18, the poem is The Unknown Citizen. It's by W.H. Auden. It's a great example of how verbal irony can carry through from start to finish. But there are all different kinds of ways that we can describe tone otherwise, if it's not verbal irony. We can have a humorous tone, a playful tone, a hopeful tone, an admiring tone, tragic, solemn, somber, poignant, disillusioned, straightforward, hostile, sarcastic, ambivalent, ambiguous. So just like you would pick up on someone's tone of voice when they're speaking, pay attention to the tone of the speaker throughout the poem. Definitely pay attention to make sure you don't miss any possible verbal irony. So we're going to look at a few poems and talk about the persona that has been created in the poem. Then we're going to look at a few more and talk about elements more geared towards tone. How do we figure out the tone of the poem? So one poem in particular that is a great example of creating a persona and what we can learn about that persona is, of course, My Last Duchess. You should have read that already. But if you remember back to that poem, what are things that we learn about the speaker? And the speaker in this case, we actually know their name. It's the Duke, right? The Duke of Ferrara. What do we learn about that persona? What kind of a persona does he display? We know he's very jealous, right? He gives us plenty of examples of that. We know he's very controlling, which kind of goes along with the jealousy, but he gives us plenty of examples of that. We know that he is very much into material possessions and status, his 900-year-old name, the fact that he name drops, Frau Pandolf, who painted the portrait, and Klaus of Innsbruck, who did the bronze statue of Neptune taming the seahorse that he mentions at the end. So we learn a lot about his persona, not just what happens in the poem, but we learn a good bit about him as well. And then there's another poem, also by Robert Browning. And we have not read this one yet. I'm going to read it to you, and you can follow the link. You can open up that link that's there in the slide and take you to Porphyria's Lover. So that'll open up a browser or a tab in your browser, like on the internet, and then you can click back and forth between the tabs in your browser and the PowerPoint. But I'll read it for you real quick and then just give you a couple comments on it. This is called Porphyria's Lover. Porphyria is the woman in the poem. The speaker is her lover. He is Porphyria's lover. Porphyria now is a term that's used to describe certain blood diseases. But when Browning wrote this, those diseases had not been classified as porphyria. So he's probably not talking about a woman who has this blood disorder. He's probably if he's using it in any context at all, it would be going back to ancient Greece. It basically denotes the color purple, and purple was often the color of royalty. So there's a chance here that her name indicates her social status. And then we'll see if we learn anything about the speaker's social status as well. We learn a few other things along the way also. Okay, Porphyria's Lover. The rain set early in tonight. The sullen wind was soon awake. It tore the elm tops down for spite and did its worst to vex the lake. I listened with heart fit to break. When glided in Porphyria, straight she shut the cold out and the storm, and kneeled and made the cheerless grate blaze up and all the cottage warm. Which done, she rose, and from her form withdrew the dripping cloak and shawl, and laid her soiled gloves by, untied her hat and let the damp hair fall. And last she sat down by my side and called me. When no voice replied, she put my arm around her waist and made her smooth white shoulder bare, and all her yellow hair displaced, and stooping, made my cheek lie there, and spread over all her yellow hair. Murmuring how she loved me, she too weak, for all her heart's endeavor to set its struggling passion free from pride, and vainer ties dissever, and give herself to me forever. But passion sometimes would prevail, nor could tonight's gay feast restrain a sudden thought of one so pale for love of her, and all in vain. So she was come through wind and rain, but sure I looked up at her eyes, happy and proud. At last I knew Porphyria worshipped me. Surprise made my heart swell, and still it grew while I debated what to do. That moment she was mine, fair, perfectly pure and good. I found a thing to do, and all her hair in one long yellow string I wound 3 times her little throat around and strangled her. No pain felt she. I'm quite sure she felt no pain. As a shut bud that holds a bee, I warily oped her lids. Again laughed the blue eyes without a stain, and I untightened next the tress about her neck. Her cheek once more blushed bright beneath my burning kiss. I propped her head up as before, only this time my shoulder bore her head, which droops upon it still. The smiling rosy little head, so glad it has its utmost will, that all it scorned at once is fled, and I, its love, am gained instead. Porphyria's love. She guessed not how her darling one wish would be heard, and thus we sit together now, and all night long we have not stirred, and yet God has not said a word. Okay. So, what we get from this is Porphyria comes to his little cottage and comes in out of the storm, out of the rain, and she immediately sets the fire and starts to warm up the cottage, and she undoes her shawl and takes off her hat and comes and sits by him, and her blonde hair is all around, and she puts his head on her shoulder, and they sit there for a while. And if you think back to what I said about status, he implies in here that they are not truly together because her status is probably, she has a higher social status than him. And so she is having a hard time kind of bucking the system, if you will, and being with him despite what others might say. And he looks in her eyes and realizes that she does love him, she worships him, but she doesn't have the strength, she doesn't know how to go against social conventions to be with him. So he solves the problem by strangling her with her own hair and then sitting with her cuddled up on the couch. Yeah. So, that's that. Robert Browning was a very complicated man because he also wrote fantastically beautiful love poetry to his wife, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. But clearly, yet again, he has created a very distinct persona in the poem that is not himself. So if you wonder why I picked My Last Duchess and this one, it's for that reason, because they are so clearly not the poet. So it really reinforces that idea of how a persona is the creation of the author, not the author, him or herself. And what do we learn about this persona, though? Well, it's interesting that he's very calm, right? Her darling one wish has a very steady rhyme scheme throughout. The syntax is very, like the pattern, the rhythm holds up all the way through. And even when he strangles her and then is sitting with her, nothing changes about it. There's no disruption. Like, it's so calm and so reasonable. He sounds very loving in it, this persona. Like, he seems to truly love her. But there definitely is a sense of need for power that comes across from the persona, right? But we do learn about him. We might not understand him, but we do learn things about him based on his actions and what he shares with us. So it's important to pay attention to those clues. On the next slide, there's a link to a third poem where I want to talk about persona, and it is Siren Song by Margaret Atwood. So if you follow that link, you'll open up another page in your browser with this poem on it. And if you don't remember or had never really been into anything having to do with Greek mythology or like Ulysses, the Odyssey. In Greek mythology, there was this in the ocean, this little island of the Sirens, and the Sirens were three women who were, I think they were like part woman, part bird of some sort, and they had these beautiful, enchanting voices, and when ships would pass by, they would sing and lure the ships closer and closer and closer to them, and the men on the ships would just basically be in a trance and had no control over themselves at that point, and they would leave their ships and go to the women and basically be killed. So in the Odyssey, when Ulysses and his men are making their journey, on their ship, when they get closer to where he knows the sirens are supposed to be, he tells them to plug up their ears so that they can't hear the sirens. And that's why. So what we have here is Siren Song, and it's a very interesting take on these creatures. So, this is the one song everyone would like to learn, the song that is irresistible. The song that forces men to leap overboard in squadrons even though they see the beached skulls. The song nobody knows because anyone who has heard it is dead and the others can't remember. Shall I tell you the secret? And if I do, will you get me out of this bird suit? I don't enjoy it here, squatting on this island, looking picturesque and mythical with these two feathery maniacs. I don't enjoy singing this trio, fatal and valuable. I will tell the secret to you, and only to you. Come closer. This song is a cry for help. Help me. Only you can. You are unique. At last. Alas, it is a boring song, but it works every time. What do we learn about this persona? It's one of the sirens, right? So the persona is one of the sirens, and she sounds, she seems very angry, a bit of an angry creature. What do we learn about her? She seems, in the one part, she seems helpless, right? Like she's begging for help. But, she turns it on us, and it's clear that it was all a ruse to pull us in closer and, trap us and kill us. So she's also very untrustworthy. She's manipulative, maybe opportunistic, but she's also very cunning, very smart, right? So we learn a good bit. It's a very short poem, but we learn a good bit about this persona and how, at least this particular siren, ensnares her victims. How she lures them and tricks them, if you will. So learn a good bit about her. It's another good example of how the persona is not the author. I'm not spending a whole lot of time on these poems. It's really more just to give you the overall effect of persona and tone. And so we're going to kind of switch gears and look at a few examples and talk about the tone of the poem. And the first one is another one that we've looked at already, which is My Papa's Waltz. And we've probably already talked about tone in this one to some extent, A lot of you, when you read this poem for the first time, you pick up on some words and ideas and images and feelings that make you think that the little boy is being abused. And then when we go through the literal translation line by line, there's no hard evidence of abuse. It's very confusing. So, what is it's those words and those phrases and images that make us think abuse at first. Those are the words that create the tone of the piece. And then there's also, some other elements to it. If the whiskey on your breath could make a small boy dizzy, but I hung on like death. Such wealth it was not easy. The rhythm of the lines is the rhythm of a waltz. So in some ways the tone is very playful. But then you have, but I hung on like death, right? Then you beat time on my head. The hand that held my wrist. That's not quite. It would be different if he said the hand that jerked my wrist or something like that. But then the end, you waltz me off to bed, still clinging to your shirt. There's also words and images that create a fearful tone, almost some sort of danger, perhaps. So you have this very playful, fun tone in certain aspects, and then this very kind of fearful and darker tone in other aspects. So if I were going to describe the full tone of this piece, I would say ambiguous, because it takes you down both routes. And I think that's on purpose. I think it is intended to be ambiguous. Because even though the literal translation, you cannot see any actual abuse, everything else about it says that it is. So it's very ambiguous. And that's, I think, exactly what we're supposed to feel. That tone is the poem, practically. So it's very important to pick up on the tone and to not get frustrated or assume you're doing it wrong if you see contradicting or contrasting tones. This is a perfect example of how there can be multiple tones working together or against each other, for that matter. So don't think you're missing something or doing it wrong if you're picking up on different elements of tone. You're probably right. Keep going with it. Don't stop. Another very good example of tone, the next slide, is Those Winter Sundays by Robert Hayden. And this is another one. It's similar to My Papa's Waltz in that we have a grown man looking back on his childhood and his father in particular. But it's not quite the same story. Alright, so this one says, Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him, who had driven out the cold, and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? So, another memory, except this time, and we have a lot of the same, some of the same words being used. But on Sundays, his father would get up early, put on his clothes in the blue-black cold. What very cool description. What a very cool image. Blue-black cold. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather. So he works with his hands, right? So he would get up early in the blue-black cold, and with those achy, tired hands, made banked fires blaze. He would start the fire to start warming up the house. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking, like, you know, like when you pour warm water on something that's cold, like you'll hear it kind of, or cold water on something that's warm, you'll kind of hear it splintering, that making that sound, right? So he'd hear it because the fire has now started. He'd hear the cold splintering, breaking, because it's starting to warm up. And when the rooms were warm, he, his father, would call. I would slowly rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house. So, is the house angry? Are we talking about all the creaking and moaning that an old house might make? Or are we talking about the anger, the chronic angers within the home, between dad and mom and whoever else lives there as well, any other siblings or whatever? Speaking indifferently to him, whatever, right? To him, who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. No one ever thanked him for starting the fire, and when I came downstairs, you know, he had made it warm in the house for us, and he'd even polished my shoes. I was indifferent to him. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? Austere meaning very stern and strict, you know, and lonely offices. So he's looking back with a different type of memory about his father. There is still some suggestion that perhaps things weren't always perfect, but he's definitely looking back and realizing all the sacrifices that his father made for him and for the rest of the family, and that no one ever thanked him. And so for me, the language and the words that he's very somber, right? Very serious, poignant in a way. Poignant is almost like in a sad way, if you will. He's almost apologetic. Definitely, I get a regretful tone from it as well. But a very different type of memory of childhood and a different tone than my papa's waltz had. See what else you pick up on when you read it, what other kinds of tones you associate with it. And then the last one that I want to look at is called Barbie Doll by Marge Piercy. If you click on that link, it'll take you to that link in the slide. It'll open up a web page with a PDF. It says, Barbie Doll. This girl child was born as usual and presented dolls that did pee-pee and miniature GE stoves and irons and wee lipsticks the color of cherry candy. Then in the magic of puberty, a classmate said, "You have a great big nose and fat legs." She was healthy, tested intelligent, possessed strong arms and back, abundant sexual drive and manual dexterity. She went to and fro apologizing. Everyone saw a fat nose on thick legs. She was advised to play coy, exhorted to come on hearty, exercise, diet, smile, and wheedle. Her good nature wore out like a fan belt, so she cut off her nose and her legs and offered them up. In the casket displayed on satin, she lay with the undertaker's cosmetics painted on, a turned-up putty nose, dressed in pink and white nightie. "Doesn't she look pretty?" everyone said. Consummation at last. To every woman, a happy ending. So, this is a very interesting poem. Clearly, you know, we have this girl that's born, and she's very typical, very just average girl. Someone, though, in puberty, probably junior high, tells her she's got a big nose and fat legs, and man, it just ruins her. You know, she's healthy, she's intelligent, she's got all these great things going for her, but all everyone ever saw was the fat nose and thick legs, or at least that's what she thought. Um, she has all these competing things going on. She's advised to play coy, but then at the same time exhorted to come on, hardy. Uh, Exercise, diet, smile, and reader. And she finally just, her good nature wore out. She cut off her nose and her legs and offered them up. And there she is in the casket. And he says, oh, doesn't she look pretty? Consummation at last. To every woman, a happy ending. Like, finally. She finally got what she was looking for. Isn't she pretty? It's interesting that in the beginning of this, we almost have a very straightforward, almost like a blasé tone. Like, it's just very matter of fact. Like, the girl child was, but a little bit of sarcasm going on because the girl child was born as usual and presented dolls that did pee-pee and miniature G stoves and irons and wee lipsticks the color of cherry candy. So there's a little bit of sarcasm thrown in there. But for the most part, it's just kind of straightforward and blasé. She was healthy, tested, intelligent, possessed strong arms and back, abundant sexual drive, and manual dexterity. She went to and fro, apologizing. Everyone saw a fat nose on thick legs. Then we get a little more sarcastic. You know, her good nature wore out like a fan belt. So she cut off her nose and legs and offered them up. There we get a little gruesome. It's a little bit of a gruesome tone. And then the sarcasm comes on full force at the end. In the casket displayed on satin, she lay with the Undertaker's cosmetics painted on, a turned-up putty nose, dressed in a pink and white nightie. Doesn't she look pretty? Everyone said. Consummation at last. Very sarcastic. And then we have some verbal irony at the very end. To every woman, a happy ending. Because clearly this was not a happy ending. So definitely some verbal irony happening there. But you can see that listening and really looking at the speaker of the poem, paying attention to what they share with us, how they share it, that we learn about that persona, and that how they share with us is where we pick up on the tone. And that is an important step in figuring out what the poet wanted us to get from the poem. So the persona that is created as well as the tones that are used are clues to help us figure out what the poet wanted us to take away from the poem. So if you have any questions about persona and tone, let me know. Otherwise, you guys are free to move on.